Tonight on Uncorking the Issues, a missing gavel, a democracy bucket, a point of order sprinting for its life, and a school board meeting that somehow managed to be about everything except school. I'm Grapevine, and this is Uncorking the Issues, pouring clarity into Temecula Valley politics. Welcome to our first episode called Chaos on the Dais. And if you've ever wondered what happens when grown adults treat parliamentary procedure like a contact sport, congratulations, you're about to get a front row seat. Quick note, this is commentary based on what was said in a public meeting. I'm not naming student speakers because minors deserve privacy, even when adults insist on turning school governance into a reality show. Also, not legal advice, not therapy, and definitely not a substitute for functional leadership. It's a podcast. All right, let's pour. Before we get into the play-by-play, let's meet our cast, because this meeting had characters. You've got Trustee Emil Barham, who approaches the agenda like it's a triage unit. We are bleeding time. Stop talking. Vote. You've got Trustee Steve Schwartz, veteran educator energy, clipboard dad, but with a pension and committee lists. You've got Trustee Jen Wiersma, who speaks in a blend of policy, parental rights framing, and I network with trustees. You've got Trustee Joe Komrosky, who frames the entire universe as a battle between parents and darkness, and loves a moral crusade. And you've got Dr. Melinda Anderson, who brings full light versus darkness theology, personal grievance, and the vibe of someone who truly believes a school board meeting is also a spiritual retreat. And floating above it all, trying to keep the plane from landing upside down, is district leadership facilitating process as best they can. Okay, let's start where the meeting gets interesting. 3 student speakers, actual students, doing what adults later prove they cannot: speak clearly, stay on topic, and maintain basic impulse control. One student asks the board to vote for steady student-centered leadership. Another student says, in essence, colleges Google our district and we look embarrassing. And a senior speaks about LGBTQ students, transgender students, and the real-world impact of board decisions on student safety and mental health. And it's worth saying, those students didn't sound radical. They sounded like students who want a district that isn't a headline machine. For about 10 minutes, the students modeled what governance is supposed to look like: reality-based, specific, focused on impact, and delivered with more maturity than half the adults who later used the phrase for the kids like a magic spell. Then the adults immediately proved the students' point. Barham, presiding early on, moves things along and thanks the students, then pivots to consent calendar business. And here's his recurring theme all night: we need to get to the priority of business. Translation: the reorganization vote. He is clearly trying to keep the meeting moving, sometimes in a helpful way, sometimes in a shove everything into January way. We hit the consent calendar, that part of meetings where routine items pass quickly. Fine. But even here, you can feel the tension, like the agenda is a treadmill and everybody's trying not to fly off the back. And a public speaker suggests subcommittees, including one on classroom violence. That's real. And Barham makes a motion to postpone subcommittee discussion to the next board meeting because he wants to get to priority business. Now, here's where we start seeing the board member dynamics. Komrosky jumps in with a pointed question, not about classroom violence, but about the drug awareness subcommittee, asking Wiersma if she has alternatives ready, and specifically whether there could be a substitute plan if something else, a Riverside program, doesn't get approved. Wiersma responds like someone who wants the record to show she's doing homework. She says she plans to talk with district staff, she's researched programs, and she emphasizes that the board supports kids getting help with addiction across the board. She brings up family involvement, increasing likelihood of success, and mentions ideas like above the influence for middle school and DARE, and notes those options were previously turned down. And Schwartz adds a practical note: drug awareness programs like Red Ribbon Week exist, but families can't always afford treatment. And he references why a certain proposed program was appealing, because it would cost families nothing. He's trying to keep it anchored in access and feasibility. So even in the subcommittee discussion, you can already see the split. Wiersma plus Komrosky structure the conversation around parental rights, appropriate programs, and what gets approved politically. Schwartz focus on access, student support, practical legality. Barham, procedural urgency, move it along, vote, get to the big item. They vote to postpone the subcommittee discussion. Then comes the caregiver affidavit policy conversation. This is where the meeting tries to do something serious, and the board basically demonstrates why seriousness is hard for them. A parent speaks from lived experience, taking in a relative's child, navigating caregiver affidavits, and he warns the policy language could create barriers for families in crisis. Another speaker says the proposal feels performative, tied to state law changes and not based on need. Wiersma responds. She frames it as a first read for discussion, says the goal is safeguards, mentions statewide angst about a new law, and stresses she wants district-wide consistency. She brings up trafficking concerns, saying another county leader mentioned it, and argues for things like photo ID and stronger checks. And Schwartz does something important. He asks directly where the draft came from. When she says it came from another trustee in a different district, Schwartz essentially says, that explains the flaws, and then he lists what he believes are legal problems, saying notarization requirements and verification requirements conflict with state education code, and arguing it needs to be revised to be lawful. This is peak Schwartz, teacher administrator energy. But in board form, I'm not trying to be rude, I'm trying to be accurate. District staff then clarifies, they already have checks and balances and centralized verification systems, and they received legal guidance that some things, like notarization requirements, could be problematic. And staff emphasizes they are required to develop model guidelines by spring. So in this segment, the board member sound bites are clear. Wiersma, we need safeguards. I'm thinking outside the box. Trafficking is a concern. We can tighten things up. Schwartz, fine, but do it legally and stop copy-pasting bad policy. Barham facilitates, tries to keep time, keeps moving. Komrosky backs Wiersma, frames it as dying on the hill of parental rights. Okay, now we hit the main dramatic arc, the Roos MO discussion. Multiple public speakers urge approval, emphasizing parental consent and treatment needs. A staff leader clarifies repeatedly, parental consent is required. Discipline and intervention go together. Students can't just self-refer without home contact. Barham then makes one of the clearest cell phone and reframe speeches of the night. He says he originally voted against the program for not a good reason because he was distracted by outside noise and pressure. Then he says he investigated and changed his mind. He argues treatment is not the same as prevention, says the district is out of compliance, it lacks intervention options, emphasizes that the program is free, and references 117 students served and claimed strong outcomes. That is Barham in his element. I was wrong. I looked into it. This is fiscally and operationally necessary. But then Anderson returns midstream and raises a point of order. She says the board had motioned earlier to postpone this indefinitely, definitely, and she wants clarity on whether they're even supposed to be debating it. And this is where the meeting becomes a procedural blender. Barham argues about Robert's rules, saying postponement motions must be done properly with the main motion, and he keeps pushing forward. Anderson insists the postponement stands. Komorowski says he asked about moving it later in the agenda, and there wasn't consensus. The board bickers over what happened and what is valid, and it turns into a clash of chair authority, procedure, and personal tension. Anderson ultimately calls a recess because that's her go-to emergency break. When the meeting returns, Anderson issues what amounts to a behavior warning to Barham, saying he's out of order and that attorneys have never witnessed behavior like it from a board member. Barham responds that she can't remove him by law. Again, not policy, not students, procedural combat. Then the meeting pivots to the financial report, and suddenly everyone remembers they are part of a public institution. During the first interim financial report, a public speaker warns about projected deficits. Staff presents improvements in attendance, TK-driven funding, cost containment, and the need to plan for volatility in state funding. Board members respond with unusually calm gratitude. Wiersma thanks staff and says the board takes it seriously. Schwartz praises the precision of budget projections and staff competence. Barham echoes that and says, as a finance person, he has no concerns about the work. Komrosky thanks staff and drops a pop culture reference because, of course, he does. Anderson motions for a positive certification, and it passes unanimously. And that moment, calm, procedural, coherent, is important because it shows the board can behave when it wants to, which makes the chaos more of a choice than an accident. Now comes reorganization. Anderson takes time for personal remarks. She talks about attending a Light the World event with LDS Community Connections, and she says she believes she's experienced religious persecution related to her association with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. She emphasizes religious tolerance and suggests some of what happened this year has been driven by that. She invites people to support local charity giving machines. This matters because her light versus darkness frame becomes a constant theme in her voting explanation later. She is not operating like a neutral chair. She's operating like a narrator of her own morality play. When the board discusses how to run the election process, Komrosky says, forget the bucket, just mic up and nominate because he thinks elected officials shouldn't be pulling names out of a bucket. Barham wants the bucket because last time was a free-for-all. And district leadership explains the bucket isn't choosing the president, it is choosing who gets to nominate first so nobody has to scream over each other. They agree to use the bucket. Public comment continues. Then the student board member gives a professional rubric about what a board president should be. Student focus, collaboration, professionalism, distinction between board and staff roles. And she says, based on that rubric, she believes Schwartz demonstrates the leadership qualities needed. That statement hits like a clean sip of water in the middle of a bar fight. Now the election begins. First nomination round. Barham nominates Schwartz and praises him. Barham emphasizes Schwartz is liked by students, teachers, administrators. He mentions Schwartz has voted in ways that cross ideological lines, and he frames Schwartz as common sense, student-centered. Schwartz then gives his resume and value speech. He says school boards are nonpartisan, non-religious in governance, lists his education background and decades in public education, lists his committee involvement, and repeats his mantra, students, schools, and saving money. He frames himself as focused on education, not politics. Anderson then says she's going to vote no on everyone in the first round, so she won't be the deciding vote, and everyone gets heard. She compliments Schwartz, calls him a good man, and continues her light-dark metaphor, saying he reflects light most of the time. Then Wiersma explains why she's voting no on Schwartz. This is where she gets explicit. She argues elections matter, community-elected conservative trustees. She dislikes his endorsements. She criticizes his votes on specific policies, flags, a rubric policy she references, and she frames him as not aligned with what she calls the community's values. She also notes he's left the dais before instead of debating. The vote fails. Schwartz gets 2 yes votes and 3 no votes. Next, Wiersma nominates Komrosky. Wiersma gives a growth and redemption speech, saying she and Komrosky have changed, they've made mistakes, but she believes he'll lead differently now. She says he cares about students, talks about parental rights and privacy issues, and frames him as aligned with conservative priorities. Komrosky then speaks in his signature style. He denies claims he's responsible for millions in legal fees. He says he represents parents because students are minors. He frames his work as shielding students from darkness and wokeism. He claims he supports all students, but insists certain topics don't belong in classrooms. Emphasizes his efforts on protecting innocence, banning what he calls obscene content, and pushing for parent surveys. Schwartz responds, he says school boards are nonpartisan, he doesn't want politics dividing the community, and he references prior controversies and legal exposure, arguing Komrosky has not been good for the district and has cost money. That vote fails, too. Now we're in the everyone pass. Anderson decides portion. Anderson asks for time to explain herself, and she delivers a long speech about online attacks, darkness, and poison in the conservative community. She says she's apprehensive about supporting Komrosky because of the behavior of some supporters, though she says she's not accusing him personally of that behavior. She describes being targeted, says she's blessed personally, but disturbed by cruelty and gossip, and asks people to stop engaging with troll accounts. Wiersma responds with empathy, but also a political reality check. She says politics can be ugly. She's also faced attacks, and she claims Komrosky tries to disengage from those factions. She urges Anderson to vote based on the man, not the broader ugliness. Then things go off the rails again. Schwartz nominates Barham briefly, seemingly trying to relieve Anderson of being the deciding vote, but that doesn't become the path forward. Anderson pivots to a controversy involving blackmail allegations and the reporting of an attorney to the state bar. She emphasizes that she believes there was no blackmail and says she's upset that something was reported, implying it was meant to affect her voting or power dynamics. She says this influences her vote. Barham responds by saying Anderson told people she was being blackmailed and says district council had heard similar things. He frames her as spreading that claim and being unstable. He also makes additional claims about investigation, which Anderson denies. The whole exchange is chaotic and deeply personal. Exactly what a board reorganization should not be. Then Anderson nominates Komrosky and says, bluntly, that Barham's behavior influenced her decision. She says you can thank Emil Barham for that. Schwartz responds with a warning. He says there will be consequences, money, lawsuits, impacts to students, and suggests he may step away if it becomes untenable. He frames it as consequences, not a threat. Komrosky calls Schwartz's statement intimidating and hypocritical. He also makes a remark about Schwartz's lapel pin as evidence of wokeism, and Anderson tells him to stop because she hasn't voted yet and he's not helping. Then the roll is called. Anderson votes yes, and Komrosky becomes board president. And if you're wondering how this is going, don't worry. The sequel begins immediately. They move to elect a clerk. Komrosky makes a motion to suspend the bucket process and go straight to appointment. It passes 3-2. Komrosky nominates Schwartz for clerk. Schwartz declines. He says, memorably, he's not going to be anyone's mate if he's not the captain. He doesn't want the role. Komrosky nominates Anderson. She says no, asks people not to second. Someone seconds anyway. That motion fails. Komrosky nominates Wiersma. That motion also fails. Schwartz nominates Barham. Barham seconds. Anderson objects and accuses Barham of threatening her husband, escalating the situation. Barham tells her to take her antics elsewhere. The vote fails. They're stuck. Komrosky says they're at an impasse. They consult attorneys. And then, due to safety concerns, the meeting is adjourned and pushed to the next meeting. Let me underline the lesson here. This meeting was full of people saying for the kids. The students spoke like it was for the kids. The adults fought like it was for the chair. So, if you're trying to understand what each board member said, here's the distilled version. Barham said, we need treatment options, we need compliance, we need to support students, and also procedurally. He tried to drive the agenda to the reorg. He also escalated personal conflict later in ways that became combustible. Schwartz said, keep politics out, follow the law, focus on students, and stop writing unlawful policy. He positioned himself as experienced educator leadership. He also warned of consequences if the board chooses what he sees as chaos. Wiersma said, safeguards, parental rights, values alignment, and conservative priorities matter. She argued Schwartz doesn't reflect community values right now. She defended Komrosky as changed and ready to lead. Komrosky said, I represent parents, not students. The mission is shielding kids from darkness. Parental rights are the hill, and he framed criticism as political hostility rather than governance feedback. Anderson said, this is about light and darkness. She believes she's been targeted and persecuted. She does not want to reward toxic behavior. And she explicitly said Barham's behavior pushed her vote toward Komrosky. Then the clerk election devolved into safety concerns and adjournment. And what did the students say? They said, please stop being embarrassing. Please run the district like adults. Please lead like professionals. Honestly, they were right. Tasting notes from tonight's bottle, on the nose, sharp ethanol of grievance politics. On the palate, over-oaked ego with a long finish of, we'll bring it back next meeting. Pair with a headache, a group chat, and a calendar reminder that local elections matter more than your hottest take. If you're exhausted, I get it, but disengagement is how chaos wins. Read the agendas, watch when you can, ask for drafts in plain language, demand evidence over vibes, push for policies that protect kids without harming families. And for the love of all that is publicly funded, insist adults behave like adults. I'm Grapevine, and this was Uncorking the Issues, pouring clarity into Temecula Valley politics. Until next time, stay hydrated, stay engaged, and please keep your democracy out of the box.